What began as a distant conflict in Southeast Asia would become one of the most divisive wars in American history. For nearly 2 decades, the United States sent its sons and daughters to fight in a land they barely understood, against an enemy that refused to surrender, for a cause that became increasingly unclear. What started as military advice became a full-scale war. What was promised as a quick victory became a grinding stalemate. And what was sold to the American people as a noble cause was ultimately revealed to be something far more complicated. More than 58,000 Americans would lose their lives. A nation would be torn apart at home, and the war would leave scars that stretched far beyond the battlefield, changing America forever. This is the story of how the United States was drawn deeper and deeper into a war it did not fully understand. To understand America's role in Vietnam, we must first step back and understand Vietnam itself. This beautiful country, nestled between the South China Sea and Laos, has a history as rich and complicated as any on Earth. For nearly 1,000 years, Vietnam fought to free itself from Chinese domination. Then came the French. In the 19th century, France colonized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, claiming them as its prized possession in Southeast Asia. For nearly a century, the French extracted wealth from these lands while providing little in return. The Vietnamese, proud and resourceful, never truly accepted foreign rule. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to boil over. That opportunity came in the 1940s. During World War II, a Vietnamese revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh, who had spent decades fighting for his country's independence, founded a movement called the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. When Japan occupied French Indochina during the war, Ho Chi Minh's guerrillas fought against both the Japanese occupiers and the Vichy French collaborators. By the time World War II ended, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh had become heroes to many Vietnamese people. They represented something powerful, the promise of independence. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, yes, but he was a nationalist first. He wrote letters to the American government, believing that the United States, a nation born from revolution against colonialism, might support Vietnamese independence. But America was not listening. The Cold War was beginning, and communism had become the great fear of the Western world. The French disaster and American hesitation. After World War II, France tried to reclaim its colony. The Viet Minh resisted. What followed was the First Indochina War, a brutal conflict that would foreshadow everything that was to come. This is where America entered the picture, almost by accident. As France struggled against the Viet Minh, American policymakers grew terrified. They saw Ho Chi Minh not as a patriot or a nationalist, but as a communist agent, a dangerous domino that might fall and cause others to tumble after it. This fear, more than any careful strategic analysis, would drive American policy for the next 30 years. By 1950, the United States began sending military aid to the French, millions of dollars, weapons, ammunition, advisors. Americans did not send soldiers yet, but they sent money and equipment. By 1953, the United States was paying roughly 80% of the cost of France's war in Indochina. This was, in essence, an American-funded war fought by French soldiers and won at the cost of Vietnamese lives. But even with American support, the French were failing. The Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Vo Nguyen, Giap, controlled the countryside. The French held the cities, or thought they did. Every day, the situation grew worse. Then came Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, the French made a catastrophic strategic error. They established a major fortified base in a valley called Dien Bien Phu, in northwestern Vietnam, far from their supply lines. They believed they could defend it against the Viet Minh. They were wrong. General Giap surrounded the base with tens of thousands of troops and subjected it to a relentless siege. The French fought valiantly, but they were trapped in a valley against an enemy that controlled the high ground. America watched in horror. Some officials even suggested using atomic weapons to save the French position. President Eisenhower, who had seen enough war, refused. In May 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell. The French surrendered, and their colonial adventure in Indochina was over. The partition and the domino theory. In the summer of 1954, international negotiations began in Geneva, Switzerland. The world had to decide what would become of Vietnam. The accords that resulted were supposed to be temporary, a way to create a ceasefire between North and South while elections were held to reunify the country peacefully. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and the Communists controlled the North. The anti-communist South would be led by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. Elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country, under whichever government the Vietnamese people chose. Those elections never happened, and America would make sure they did not. Everyone understood what the elections would bring. Ho Chi Minh was a hero to most Vietnamese people. His name was synonymous with independence. If elections were held, Ho Chi Minh would likely win. The communists would control all of Vietnam. American leaders saw only the threat, not the nationalist roots of Ho Chi Minh's movement. This became known as the Domino Theory, and it would be the justification for everything that followed. To stop that first domino from falling, America decided to prevent the elections. Instead, the United States would prop up Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam and turn him into a barrier against communism. The Diem years, building a hollow state. Ngo Dinh Diem was not a popular leader. He was a Catholic in a largely Buddhist country. He was authoritarian and corrupt. He surrounded himself with family members, including his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and Ngu's wife, famous for her ruthlessness. But Diem had one thing going for him. He was anti-communist, and that was enough for America. Beginning in 1954, American military advisors arrived in South Vietnam. At first, there were just a few hundred. Their job was to train and advise the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, on how to fight a modern war. Officially, these advisors were not combatants. But the line between advising and fighting is thin, and it would grow thinner every year. The Diem government was failing to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. Instead of building a functioning democracy, Diem ruled with an iron fist. He arrested and imprisoned anyone suspected of being a communist or sympathizing with the North. Innocent people were swept up in his crackdown. In 1956, when the scheduled elections for reunification never materialized, the South Vietnamese who had dreamed of unification felt betrayed. Many of them, particularly those who had supported Ho Chi Minh during the anti-French struggle, began to support a new insurgency against Diem. This insurgency became known as the Viet Cong, short for Vietnamese Communists, although many of its members joined not because they were communists, but because they felt they had no other choice. By 1960, the Viet Cong controlled large portions of the South Vietnamese countryside. Diem's government controlled the cities, but even that control was tenuous. The regime was increasingly unpopular. When John F. Kennedy took office as president in 1961, he inherited a deteriorating situation in Vietnam. Kennedy was young, idealistic, and eager to demonstrate American strength in the Cold War. He believed in counterinsurgency, the idea that with the right tactics and sufficient force, America could defeat communist insurgents. He saw Vietnam as a testing ground for this approach. Kennedy increased the number of military advisors in Vietnam from about 900 to over 16,000. By the time of his death in 1963, these men were still officially advisors, but they were increasingly involved in combat operations. They went on patrols, raids, and trained the ARVN in more aggressive tactics. Meanwhile, the situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate. The Viet Cong grew stronger. The ARVN proved ineffective. Diem's government became increasingly unpopular, especially after his forces brutally suppressed Buddhist protests in 1963. In November 1963, American officials, fearing that Diem could not win the war, gave tacit approval to a coup. On November 2nd, Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Nhu were assassinated by members of the South Vietnamese military. Their bodies were mutilated and dumped in the back of an armored personnel carrier. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The dominoes, it seemed, were falling faster than anyone had anticipated. The escalation, from advisors to war. When Lyndon Baines Johnson became president in December 1963, he inherited Kennedy's war in Vietnam. He also inherited Kennedy's belief that America must not allow communism to spread in Southeast Asia. But unlike Kennedy, Johnson did not have an interest in subtle counterinsurgency efforts. Johnson wanted victory, and he believed that the way to achieve victory was through overwhelming force. In early 1964, the situation in South Vietnam was dire. The Viet Cong controlled more territory than ever. The ARVN was demoralized. The government in Saigon was unstable and unpopular. American advisors were being killed at an increasing rate. Something had to be done. But what? American public opinion did not support a full-scale war in Vietnam. Congress was skeptical. The American people knew little about Vietnam and cared even less. To go to war, Johnson would need an incident. Something dramatic that would convince the American people that the United States had been attacked and that military action was justified. In August 1964, that incident appeared to happen. The Gulf of Tonkin, the incident that changed everything. The USS Maddox was an American destroyer operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. The Maddox was on what was called a De Soto patrol, a reconnaissance mission. On August 2, 1964, the Maddox reported that it had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. What happened that day is still debated by historians. Some reports say the Maddox fired first. Others say it acted in self-defense. The details are murky, but the attack, whatever exactly happened, was relatively minor. No one was killed. The Maddox was not seriously damaged. President Johnson now had the incident he needed. He ordered another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, to join the Maddox in the Gulf. He ordered both ships to resume their patrols and to attack any force that attacked them. In effect, he created conditions that could easily lead to another clash. Then, on August 4th, the Maddox and Turner Joy reported that they had been attacked again. Radar reports indicated North Vietnamese torpedo boats approaching. The two destroyers opened fire, allegedly hitting several targets. But in the darkness and confusion, with neither ship able to clearly see supposed attackers, it is unlikely that an actual second attack occurred. Years later, it became clear that the second attack probably never happened at all. It was a radar misreading, a misunderstanding, perhaps influenced by expectation and fear. At the time, however, President Johnson presented it to Congress as a clear act of aggression. He asked for a resolution authorizing him to take whatever military actions he deemed necessary in Vietnam. Congress, with almost no real debate, passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution by overwhelming majorities. This resolution, based in part on an incident that likely never happened, gave President Johnson essentially a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. Senator Wayne Morse, one of only 2 senators to vote against the resolution, warned that this measure was a step toward eroding the Constitution. He reminded his colleagues that the Constitution vests in Congress the power to declare war. His warning was largely ignored. The American people, most of whom knew almost nothing about Vietnam, were told that their president had acted decisively to respond to North Vietnamese aggression. Public approval of Johnson's handling of Vietnam soared. Operation Rolling Thunder. The bombing campaign. With the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in hand, President Johnson began planning a massive escalation of the war. The plan was bold and, as it turned out, deeply flawed. Beginning in February 1965, the United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to destroy North Vietnam's ability and willingness to continue the war. American bombers, flying from bases in Thailand and from aircraft carriers in the Gulf, would pound the North with bombs for nearly 4 years. The scale of the bombing was staggering. By the time Rolling Thunder ended in late 1968, American and South Vietnamese aircraft had dropped over 1 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam. This exceeded the tonnage dropped on Japan during World War II. General Curtis LeMay, who had overseen the firebombing of Japan in World War II, believed that air power could force North Vietnam to negotiate. American military analysis claimed that rolling thunder was destroying large shares of North Vietnam's fuel, power generation, and ammunition storage capacity. By those measures, North Vietnam should have been unable to continue the war. But it did continue, and there were reasons why. North Vietnam received extensive support from both the Soviet Union and China. These allies supplied trucks, weapons, ammunition, fuel, and even air defense systems. As the United States destroyed facilities in North Vietnam, the Soviets and Chinese helped replace them or shifted supply routes. Bomb damage hurt, but it did not choke off the flow of support to the battlefield in the south. The bombing campaign also had massive human costs. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians were killed. American pilots, flying at altitude and under fire, often could not distinguish military targets from civilian areas. Hospitals, schools, and villages were hit. Farms and irrigation systems were destroyed. The bombing was supposed to break the will of the North Vietnamese people. Instead, it often hardened their resolve. Every bomb that hit a village or school produced new anger and grief. The cost to America was also high. Nearly 1,000 American aircraft were shot down or lost during rolling thunder. Many pilots were killed. Others were captured and held as prisoners of war in harsh conditions, some for many years. Yet Operation Rolling Thunder did not bring North Vietnam to the negotiating table on American terms. It did not prevent North Vietnam from supporting the war in the South. It foreshadowed a harsh truth. Air power alone could not win this conflict. Americanization, ground war begins. While bombs rained down from above, the war on the ground was also changing. The South Vietnamese army was faltering. Corruption, poor leadership, and low morale undermined its effectiveness. The Viet Cong insurgency was gaining strength. North Vietnamese regular units were increasingly active in the south. In March 1965, the first official American combat troops landed at Da Nang. They were Marines, about 3,500 strong, coming ashore in what they had trained to expect would be a hostile landing. Instead, they were greeted by smiling South Vietnamese civilians and officials. Cameras showed Marines in full gear, stepping onto the beach as if they were tourists. But behind that image lay the beginning of America's direct ground war. This marked the Americanization of the conflict. More troops followed. By the end of 1965, there were around 184,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, about 385,000. By late 1967, roughly 485,000. The peak came around 1968 and 1969, with more than 540,000 American soldiers deployed in Vietnam. Many of these soldiers were draftees, young men, often in their late teens or early 20s, who had been conscripted into service. They found themselves in a faraway country, in a war that even politicians struggled to define clearly. The American military had superior technology, organization, training, and firepower. It fielded helicopters in unprecedented numbers, tanks, artillery, and advanced communications. On paper, there was no question which side had the advantage. Yet, the war dragged on. The nature of the enemy, guerrilla warfare. One key reason for the American struggle was the nature of the enemy. The Viet Cong were not conventional soldiers in neat formations. They were guerrilla fighters. They blended into the civilian population. They struck at night or from ambush. They used booby traps, mines, and hit-and-run tactics rather than large set-piece battles. A Viet Cong fighter might be a farmer during the day and a guerrilla at night. He lived among the people. His family and friends were often in the same village. To American soldiers, he looked like any other villager. When American patrols moved through rural areas, they could not reliably distinguish who supported the government and who supported the insurgency. The Viet Cong also built extensive tunnel systems, especially in areas like Siu Chi. These tunnels held living quarters, hospitals, armories, and command centers. They allowed fighters to move, hide, and strike unexpectedly. An American soldier could walk over a patch of ground that looked like any other, having no idea that an enemy network lay just beneath his boots. Booby traps and mines were a constant threat. Sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in pits, often coated in filth, could cause terrible injuries and infections. Mines made from artillery shells or simple explosive devices could blow off limbs or kill instantly. These devices took a constant psychological toll on American troops, who could never feel safe even in seemingly quiet areas. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces from 1964 to 1968, believed that the war could be won through attrition, by killing enemy troops faster than they could be replaced. He focused on body counts as a key measure of progress. High kill ratios were touted as signs that victory was near. But attrition was a flawed strategy in this context. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were willing to absorb enormous losses to achieve their political goals. They also controlled the timing and location of most engagements, allowing them to limit their exposure when necessary, and make sudden, devastating strikes when conditions favored them. The war became a struggle, not just of numbers, but of will and endurance. The Ground War, operation after operation. American forces conducted numerous major operations in Vietnam, each designed to weaken the enemy and assert control over contested areas. Operation White Wing in early 1966 saw the 1st Cavalry Division and Allied forces sweep Binh Dinh province, seeking to destroy enemy main force units and disrupt their base areas. Operation Hastings in mid-1966 involved heavy fighting near the demilitarized zone in the north, as Marines clashed with North Vietnamese units infiltrating across the border. Operation Junction City in 1967 was one of the largest U.S. operations of the war. Over 20 American battalions and several South Vietnamese units attacked the so-called Iron Triangle, a Viet Cong stronghold northwest of Saigon. They seized supplies, captured documents, and inflicted casualties. Operation Delaware, and later operations in the A Shau Valley, aimed to disrupt enemy bases and supply routes in that strategically important region. On paper, many of these operations were successes. Commanders reported large numbers of enemy dead and impressive statistics on supplies captured or destroyed. Press briefings emphasized favorable kill ratios and expressed confidence that victory was approaching. Yet the overall situation did not fundamentally improve. Once American units left an area, enemy forces often returned. Village loyalties remained uncertain or tilted toward the Viet Cong. The central government in Saigon failed to deliver effective governance and security that could win long-term popular support. For American soldiers, the war became a grueling routine of patrols, ambushes, search and destroy missions, and base defense. The jungle, the climate, and disease were constant enemies. Heat, humidity, monsoon rains, and mud made daily life physically exhausting. Insects, leeches, and disease added to the misery. Soldiers rotated in and out of combat zones, but the sense of danger never fully left them. The psychological burden was enormous. Many soldiers developed a numbness, a defensive emotional distance. Each patrol could be their last. Each quiet moment could explode into sudden violence. The human story, courage, and fear. Behind the statistics and strategies were the lives of young men and women. To truly understand Vietnam, we must listen to their voices. One veteran remembered receiving his orders to report for basic training in the mail. His parents were furious and tried to find a way out of his enlistment. He told them simply that he had no real choice. The system had selected him, and his life was about to change forever. Another veteran, we will call him Jerry, talked about the emotional distance he maintained as a leader. He did not want to become too close to the men under his command. He knew that some of them would be wounded or killed, and he feared that getting too close would make those losses unbearable. He recalled a close friend who was grievously wounded in action, severely eviscerated, yet still conscious. The friend begged him not to let the medics take him, pleading for an end to his suffering. Jerry made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. In his mind, it was an act of mercy, but it also underscored the terrible choices war forces on ordinary people. Jerry described fear as a constant presence. From the moment I got there, he would later say, fear was a motivator. It sharpened his senses. It reminded him that every careless step could be the last. He was not ready to die. He used that fear to stay alert, to protect his men, to make decisions quickly under pressure. He also recounted times when higher-ranking officers ordered assaults or maneuvers he believed were not worth the risk. Sometimes, they got lucky and suffered few casualties. Other times, men were lost in actions that, in his view, did not need to happen. Returning home, many veterans found that their experiences did not fit easily into civilian life. Jerry recalled warning co-workers never to sneak up behind him. Surprised, he might react violently without thinking. War had rewired his instincts. These personal stories reveal courage, loyalty, fear, and trauma. They remind us that every statistic in this war represents a human being with a family, a past, and a hoped-for future. The dark side, My Lai, and war crimes. The Vietnam War also brought out some of the darkest aspects of human behavior. It is important to confront these truths honestly. On March 16, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, were sent on a mission to the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. Intelligence suggested that the village was a Viet Cong stronghold. Led by Lieutenant William Calley, the company entered the village. They encountered no organized resistance. There were no visible Viet Cong units firing on them. Despite this, many of the soldiers began shooting unarmed civilians. Old men, women, children, even infants were killed. Some women and girls were raped before being shot. Others were herded into ditches and machine-gunned. Over the course of several hours, more than 500 villagers were massacred. The My Lai massacre became one of the most infamous war crimes in American history. It was not a battle, it was the systematic killing of unarmed civilians. At his trial, Calley claimed that he was following orders and that his superiors had made it clear that anyone remaining in the village was to be treated as an enemy. His defense raised painful questions about command, responsibility, obedience, and moral judgment under stress. My Lai was not the only atrocity in the war, though it was the most widely known. Other incidents involved the killing of civilians, brutal interrogations, and destruction of villages. The use of napalm and Agent Orange also left long-term physical and environmental damage. These events, when they became public, further eroded support for the war. They forced Americans to confront the gap between their self-image as liberators and the reality of what was happening on the ground. They did not represent all American soldiers, many of whom acted with courage and restraint under impossible circumstances. But they were part of the war's reality, and they cannot be ignored. The Tet Offensive, the turning point. By the beginning of 1968, American leaders were telling the public that victory was within reach. General Westmoreland spoke of seeing light at the end of the tunnel. The official narrative was that the enemy was weakening. Then came Tet. On January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year ceasefire period, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive, coordinated offensive across South Vietnam. They attacked more than 100 cities, towns, and military targets simultaneously. The scale and coordination surprised both American and South Vietnamese forces. In Saigon, they attacked the presidential palace, the radio station, and even the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. In Hue, they seized large sections of the city and held them for weeks, engaging in brutal urban combat with American and South Vietnamese troops. Throughout the country, surprise attacks shook the confidence of both soldiers and civilians. From a strictly military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the North and the Viet Cong. American and South Vietnamese forces eventually beat back the attacks and inflicted devastating casualties. The Viet Cong suffered losses that it would never fully recover from. In many areas, their local infrastructure was shattered. But in the realm of public opinion and political impact, Tet was a turning point against the United States. Television images showed Americans that the enemy was far from defeated. They saw fighting in cities that they had been told were secure. They heard that the enemy could strike virtually anywhere, even the supposedly secure capital. The contradiction between official optimistic statements and the reality on the screen destroyed much of the remaining trust in government pronouncements. The respected news anchor Walter Cronkite traveled to Vietnam after Tet to see for himself. Upon returning, he delivered a sober commentary, concluding that the best the United States might achieve was a stalemate, and that further escalation seemed unwise. When President Johnson heard Cronkite's assessment, he reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. Public support for the war began to collapse. Protests grew larger and more intense. Draft resistance increased. The war was no longer a distant policy debate, but a central crisis in American life. Johnson steps down. Nixon escalates. Facing growing opposition at home and grim realities abroad, President Johnson made a dramatic announcement on March 31, 1968. In a televised address, after discussing Vietnam and proposing a partial bombing halt, he stunned the nation by declaring that he would not seek, and would not accept, his party's nomination for another term as president. The war had broken him politically and personally. His dream of building a great society had become intertwined with an increasingly unpopular war. He left office a deeply conflicted and embattled leader. In November 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. He ran on promises of achieving peace with honor in Vietnam. Many Americans hoped Nixon would find a way to end the war quickly and bring the troops home. Instead, Nixon pursued a complex and often contradictory strategy. Publicly, he talked about Vietnamization, the process of gradually shifting the burden of fighting to South Vietnamese forces, while American troops withdrew. Privately, he authorized secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos to attack North Vietnamese sanctuaries and supply routes. These operations were kept hidden from Congress and the public for a time and would later become highly controversial. The ground war continued. While American troop levels slowly declined, casualties continued to mount. The war dragged on for 4 more bloody years, the fall of Saigon and the end of the war. In January 1973, after years of negotiations in Paris, the United States and North Vietnam signed an agreement that called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of American combat troops. American prisoners of war were to be released. The United States ended its direct military involvement in Vietnam. However, the peace was fragile. The underlying conflict between North and South Vietnam remained unresolved. Fighting resumed after the American withdrawal. The South Vietnamese government, plagued by corruption and internal divisions, struggled to defend itself without large-scale American support. In 1975, North Vietnam launched a major offensive. Without strong and sustained American backing, South Vietnamese forces crumbled. One city after another fell. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Chaos engulfed the city. American personnel and some South Vietnamese allies were evacuated by helicopter from the U.S. Embassy and other locations in a frantic airlift. Crowds of desperate people tried to reach evacuation points. Some clung to helicopters as they took off, only to fall from the sky. The South Vietnamese president announced his government's surrender. The war, at last, was over. Vietnam was reunited under communist rule. The cost, lives lost, and lives changed. The human cost of the Vietnam War was staggering. For the United States, over 58,000 service members lost their lives. More than 150,000 were wounded. Thousands more suffered psychological trauma that would affect them for decades. Families across America received telegrams informing them that a son, brother, husband, or father would not be coming home. For the Vietnamese people, the toll was even higher. Estimates vary, but hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers were killed. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers also died. Civilian casualties across North and South Vietnam are often estimated in the millions. The war left behind destroyed villages, ruined cities, and landscapes scarred by bombing, artillery, and chemical defoliants. Beyond the count of the dead and wounded, millions were displaced. Refugees fled combat zones, later fleeing the country in boats and makeshift vessels. The term boat people entered the global vocabulary as many Vietnamese risked their lives at sea, seeking safety and a new start. More than half a century after combat troops first landed at Da Nang, Vietnam remains a powerful word in the American vocabulary. It evokes images of jungle firefights, helicopters lifting off from embattled clearings, students marching in protest, and veterans standing quietly before a wall of names. This is the story of America's involvement in Vietnam, a story of fear and conviction, of power and its limits, of courage and tragedy. Above all, it is a story about people caught up in currents far larger than themselves, whose lives were forever changed by a war in a faraway land.